The following is a conversation with Mark Bamforth, an entrepreneur, investor, and mentor in life sciences. Mark has built and sold 3 contract development manufacturing organizations, also known as CDMOs, which are businesses that help pharmaceutical innovators manufacture medicinal products for patients. Mark is an amazing guy. He does a huge amount to support his home country, Scotland, and invests through his family office with his wife, Morag. This is Inside Matters. My name is Dr. James McElroy. I hope you enjoy it. So, Mark, how did a young man from Glasgow end up in biotech?
That's a very good question, James.
What's the story?
Well, the story is it started in the North Sea.
Okay.
So I did a chemical engineering degree and I was going to become a petroleum engineer. Joined a company called Britoil, which subsequently became a part of BP. But at that time, Britoil trained engineers to become petroleum engineers, go and hunt for oil. And I spent 2 years working offshore as a drilling engineer as part of my training. And then the oil price crashed. And oil, as you know, is priced globally. And there were no jobs anywhere in the world. And a little while after that, the company I was with cut almost half the workforce. And so I was let go.
Wow.
And, it was a bit of a shock, right, to be made redundant when you're in your early 20s. But there truly were no jobs in the oil industry anywhere that I could find, anywhere in the world. So I went back to more...
Was that in Aberdeen? Sorry.
I was based in Aberdeen.
Aberdeen, yeah.
But it was a global phenomena, as you could expect. And of course, I was in a frontline role. So 6 months later, those jobs were available, but I couldn't hang around for 6 months. So I ended up going back into a more mainstream chemical engineering role. Joined a company called Whitbread, 250-year-old English brewing company.
Wow.
I had worked for them in my final summer as a student in their whiskey division. And so my wife and I moved down to London, and I was based in Luton working for them. And one of the things that they asked me to do was to program manage a biotech collaboration that they had with a small biotech company that was trying to grow algae from which you could extract a valuable chemical, gamma-linolenic acid. And I learned a lot more about microbiology than I had learned at Strathclyde University by growing algae, but growing a lot of other things I didn't intend to grow. So
how were you growing the algae?
We built a photobioreactor and patented it on the roof of an old brewery.
Cool.
We took a kilometre of plastic tubing, about 1 inch plastic tubing, just to mix my units, and wrapped this around this old cooling tower structure with a heating chamber and a pump. And we put in media, and then we inoculated it with algae. And we grew algae, and after a few days, we grew a lot of other things.
Wow.
So again, a crash course in microbiology.
Yep. The undesirables were other bugs?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Pac-Man type bacteria eating up whatever they could find.
They were probably delighted, with all that algae too.
Exactly. And bad algae doesn't smell very good.
No, I can imagine,
so that was very interesting. So that was not the particular path to follow, but it got me exposed to biotech.
A taster in biotech.
And I went to a couple of conferences, and British biotech at that point was kind of the darling of the biotech development in the UK.
That was the main one, wasn't it?
They were the leaders working on oncology uses of biotech, and I went and met with I was going to say Celgene, but that's the wrong name. Celtech. Celtech, who are based in Slough, who eventually became a part of a larger company, Lonza. But Celtech built some of the first bioreactors and new technology at that time, airlift. I met with them and interviewed there, but I was also interviewed with another company who ended up joining. And this was an American company called Genzyme Corporation, who had been around since 1981. And they had acquired a couple of businesses in the UK. One was a plant making enzymes.
Right.
Fascinating plant, doing extraction from cell lines, growing cells, but also extraction from plant tissue, from animal tissue.
And the plant side, what plant was that? And can you remember what it was they were pulling out?
Which plant?
Yeah.
The plant was actually maize leaves. And we were pulling out an enzyme called Pep-C. I forget all the details of that. But we had other fascinating sources like horseradish. Could extract horseradish peroxidase from large quantities of horseradish, but animal tissue as well. So it was a fascinating plant. And then the other site was near Cambridge in England. And that was a chemical site, a fine chemical site. And we built a pharmaceutical plant there, Genzyme's first pharmaceutical plant. So I basically spent the next 12 years working at Genzyme in the UK, first running production and a technical team in Maidstone, Kent at the enzyme plant. I did an MBA along the way through a Henley Management Centre and ended up running the 2 sites in the UK. And then in the year 2000, I was invited to move to the US to run global manufacturing. And I came home and said to my wife, Maura, we've got an opportunity to move to the US. And she took about 30 seconds to say, let's do it.
Nice.
So
the adventure began.
The adventure began.
And that led to companies that you started. But before we talk about that, I'd like to talk a bit more about Genzyme. It's kind of an incredible story, isn't it?
It's an amazing story.
The founder of Genzyme and how we built it up. Did you know the founder of Genzyme?
Well, I'm not sure if you're referring to Henry Tremere. Henry wasn't the founder. He came in a couple of years after the company had started, and he took over as CEO.
Oh, I thought he was the founder.
But he was the builder of Genzyme. He was the longest-serving biotech CEO and really built that company from this fledgling organization that had an enzyme plant and a fine chemical plant and had a therapeutic product in development for very rare disease. Yeah. And that product was eventually approved, Ceridase. And again, that was an extracted product that then was replaced with a product manufactured in CHO cells in a mammalian culture. And from there, Genzyme built over 20 commercial products, as well as other services.
Amazing.
And built a company of about 12,000 people.
Amazing.
That was doing some pretty amazing things.
It's incredible. Mm-hmm. What made Henry special, in your opinion? Now, you've been a CEO, a very successful CEO, actually. Looking back, what made Henry such a good CEO? How did he manage to achieve that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's probably hard to summarize, but a few of the things. First of all, rare diseases. Nobody touched rare diseases in the 80s. The orphan drug legislation was brought in to try to encourage US companies to invest, and later on Europe brought in something similar. But rare diseases were an area that were generally ignored. Certainly big pharma weren't thinking about rare diseases in those days. Quite the opposite. They wanted blockbusters, large population diseases. But there are about 7,000 rare diseases, some of them in families, so linked. And Henry latched onto this development work that had been done originally with sponsorship from National Institute of Health in the US and partnered with the organization that did the initial work in that phase and pioneered taking this rare product to patients and showing that they could in essence be able to live a normal life if they could be treated and given this enzyme that their body was missing. The challenge was very few people were affected by those diseases.
Right.
So the price had to be very high because there were very few people who needed it.
Right.
And that was a huge challenge to the system, to insurers in the US and to the the way of getting products to patients, to get acceptance that if you have rare diseases where very few people are affected, by definition, the price is going to be high on an individual basis. But in terms of the cost to the system, it's relatively modest. Now, that was then. Today, there are many companies in rare diseases, and there's
big costs as well for drugs,
and some big costs. So, I think that situation will need to evolve to ensure that these products can continue to be developed and be affordable to society.
Yeah. I guess the thing about some of these rare disease therapies is they're one-shot cures.
Some of them are. For Genzyme, these were replacement enzymes. So they actually had to be given every couple of weeks for life.
Oh.
Now,
but transformational still.
But transformational.
Totally transformational.
People would live normally.
Yeah.
For gene therapy products, some of them are targeting those same diseases. And frankly, in the 90s, Henry saw that. Henry said, we should have gene therapy cures for these diseases in the future.
Wow.
So that was one aspect of Henry, the fact that he went after an area that nobody else would touch and figured out a business model of how to do that was sustainable. And then the other aspect to Henry was he very much believed in trying to create a structure that had autonomy. So he ended up with about a dozen business units, each with their own focus. The country structure around the world, Genzyme really pioneered making these products available everywhere at either the same price everywhere in the world or free. If there was no way of funding them, then provide those products free until we can help those countries to establish a sustainable system. And again, that's very different from the traditional pharma model, which was price it high in the US, price it as high as you can get in Europe, but it will probably be lower, and then price it whatever you can get elsewhere in the world. So again, that was a pioneering business approach, but also, again, organizationally, these countries had general managers who really viewed themselves as running a mini Genzyme within their country and had a lot of autonomy. And for my part, I grew into the position of running operations to support across those businesses largely and across those different countries.
And eventually that culminated with global responsibility, right?
Right.
In a big company.
Right. When I moved to the US, that's what I was doing.
That's where it went. So tell me about your own entrepreneurial journey then.
Well, I left Genzyme in 2010, and it was a time of great challenge. We had a viral contamination in a new facility that we were building as we were starting it up. And then it occurred also in the existing main biologics facility that we had. So this was incredibly disruptive to the supply of product to patients. Again, a product that allowed patients to live normally. And we basically had to shut down the existing facility and strip it bare and deal with the contamination that we'd never experienced before. And then the new facility also caused some delays bringing that online. So
the contamination piece, I guess just to give some context to listeners, you were manufacturing something that you wanted to have no bugs within, like a sterile.
Yeah. So we were basically growing cells that would then manufacture this enzyme. So like many factories,
cool.
So billions of cells.
Very cool.
But to grow those cells, you have to feed them. You feed them with media, you give them the right temperature, oxygen if they need it. The media, because these were processes developed in the 1980s, had a complex media that included animal-sourced materials. And that's highly likely to have been the source of contamination. Now, we had screens in place, so we would test the media to show that it didn't have any contaminants in it. But this contamination got through those screens and didn't show up. And it was then in the process that we were running. And because this was a viral contamination, we then couldn't prove that it wasn't also in the facility.
Right.
So we literally stripped the facility bare. We took all the ceiling tiles down. We took all the insulation out. We took any consumable part, rubber gaskets, anything in the process that could be a home for this viral contamination.
Wow.
And literally rebuilt the facility
so I guess
to get
when
it back online.
People think clean normally, they think, oh, that looks clean. I can't rub my finger on it. And that finger test is important, isn't it?
Right.
Some regulators who inspect facilities come in and rub the finger. But it's actually the invisible world there. And there's limits, aren't there, to what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
That's right.
So did you find where the virus came from?
Well, we found that virus had become present in one of the critical raw materials, which actually comes from New Zealand because it comes from cows, and the herds there have been isolated. And so they were believed to be viral free. But we actually were able to detect that virus in those herds as part of the subsequent investigation.
Wow. That sounds like quite a complicated, what they call supply chain. Cows from New Zealand producing something that bugs.
Serum from cows in New Zealand, yeah.
Wow. We'll get on to supply chains and why it's important to control that. But you were just starting to get into the first company and how that happened.
Yeah, so this was... I'd been interested in running a company, but frankly, not knowing how to make the leap from being deep in an operations role to becoming CEO of a company. And this crisis at Genzyme, it became clear to me that I wasn't the person to solve this, that somebody else was going to do that I should move on. And I spoke to a number of headhunters. I spoke to a number of venture capitalists, and I said, I'm interested in running a company. Do you have something for me? And what became clear to me was that their criteria for a CEO was somebody had already been a CEO. Well, how do you break into that? Because you got to be a CEO first in order to then say, okay, I've been a CEO. Yep. Somebody who's a PhD, who has either a disease expertise or perhaps a technology expertise. And so I felt there were these barriers in place. And of course, because of what was going on at Genzyme at that time as well, it also inevitably came back to, well, tell us about Genzyme and what's happening there. Well, that story was still unfolding. So it became clear to me that I was going to find it very difficult to find an opportunity to move on, and certainly an opportunity to become CEO. And so I decided that I should do it for myself and start a company. Now, I've also been involved in something called the Entrepreneurial Scotland Foundation for about 13 or 14 years. And that foundation supports undergraduates to do internships, some of them abroad, some of them in the US, but many of them within Scotland or the UK. But it also supported people who were further into their careers, maybe 10 or 15 years into their careers. And what we would do is we basically have them go to Babson. Babson is a college in Massachusetts that's actually ranked #1 in the world for entrepreneurship. And we'd have them go there and do a kind of mini MBA or crash course MBA type learning. But that sounds like it's just cramming a lot. No, this was really about experiential learning and really thinking about what it means to create a company, what the vision is, how you're going to do it, who are you going to work with, how are you going to get this off the ground. So I'd had the opportunity to go and talk to one of those classes. And it was at the beginning of the crisis at Genzyme. And then it became clear to me that I should start my own company. And the professor said to me, well, come back and tell people what you're doing. I said, but it's not done yet. He said, no, that's not the point. Come and tell them about the journey.
Yeah, the journey.
Where you are. And I took inspiration from, here were a group of people from Scotland, roughly 30 to 40-year-olds, who'd stepped out of their job to come and change direction,
right,
or increase their trajectory.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's really what I'm trying to do. So I should listen to their example and figure out how to go for it, how to make this happen.
Yeah. And that gave you the inspiration to keep going? Because if it's the first time, you don't really know what's happening in some respects, do you?
Right.
You know, it's the first time I'm doing this. Gosh, am I doing this right?
Well, what it made me do was reflect on, well, what do I know? You know, what credibility do I have? And despite the challenges that there had recently been, I spent my whole career in manufacturing and operations. So I thought it has to be manufacturing or operations based. I don't have the credibility or the experience to go and run a therapeutics company, a drug discovery company, because that's not what I spent my career doing. So I thought, okay, I should look at contract manufacturing. And the first company was focused on that. I had tried to buy a site from Johnson & Johnson for Genzyme twice as backup capacity, but it wasn't the right fit for what we needed, so it didn't go ahead. But I knew they still wanted to sell that site. It was quite a large site in St. Louis, about 150,000 square feet, 15,000 square meter site on about 15 acres.
It's big.
Had about 160 employees, and it was making Remicade, which at that point was number 2 drug in the world, and a new drug called Stelara that had just been launched a year or two earlier.
The Remicade is the anti-inflammatory drug.
That's right.
Yes.
And so, but biosimilars, so competition was on the horizon for that product.
And these biosimilars are, so Remicade's a biologic.
That's right.
So it's something that's not a small molecule, essentially.
That's right.
Yeah.
So with a small molecule, you can make an exact copy, a generic.
Yeah.
And then the pharmacist can say, I'm not giving you the branded product. Here's one that's the exact same chemical formula, but it costs the healthcare system 10% or 20% of the original innovator price. Right. But with biologics, these are much more complex molecules, and you cannot make an exact copy. There may be some small amino acid or other differences on the molecule, but the companies who've developed the biosimilars have basically shown to the regulators that these are equivalent. So they're not identical, but they're equivalent. And so the largest of those products, now there's competition where several companies have developed biosimilars. And so J&J could see that was on the horizon, and they didn't see a long-term need for them to have that facility. So I knew they still wanted to sell it. So in April 2010, I approached J&J. I was still at Genzyme at this point, but knew I was going to transition out. And I approached J&J and said, I'd like to buy the facility. And the first question they said was, like, you or Genzyme? I said, no, me. I'd like to do it. And so their next question was, do you have any money?
How are you going to do that?
I didn't have any money. And I thought, well, there's a big asset here. There's a physical building. Surely it won't be so hard to raise money. So that was the first lesson. Because it turns out, there are a lot of investors in healthcare who invest in therapeutic products and understand the risk. Some will be successful, some might crash and burn. But you tell them you want to build a manufacturing business, and that's not their shtick, right? So now you have to go and find the investors that are interested in that. And I spoke to over 30 different companies. Well, first I thought banks might lend me the money, and then I quickly discovered that banks, of course, aren't going to put themselves at the front of a business. Right. They're happy to support if you've already got funding in place and have an established plan and team, etc. Right. And we ended up getting great support from banks, but not to get it off the ground.
Just going back a step, Mark.
Yeah.
How are pharmaceuticals manufactured? There's the companies that market the drugs sometimes have their own facilities and factories, but there's also this other group called the Contract Development Manufacturing Organizations, the one that you're just about to talk about.
Absolutely.
Building. So what is the difference between the two, just for the listener?
So for pharmaceuticals, again, because these are chemical processes, you can produce an identical product and you can measure it and show it's identical. So that's allowed the industry to outsource a lot of manufacturing. And in fact, there are more FDA, the US regulatory body, approved facilities in India than there are in the US. So a lot of outsourcing went to India and then also to China and some other locations, either for low labor costs or for tax benefits. So places like Ireland or Puerto Rico or Singapore that put in tax preferential treatment. So a lot of pharmaceuticals have been outsourced to contract development and manufacturing organizations. Biologics, on the other hand, are harder to make. The quality control, the level of operational control is really critical, because if your equipment isn't comparable and your way of operating it isn't comparable, you can end up with a different product. Because again, these are living systems where you're using cells as a mini factory to make a protein or an enzyme.
And that would be a problem. You need your product to be the same.
Correct.
Because you want the effect to be the same and not to have different side effects and so on, right?
Right, exactly. But there's one other feature of that. So whilst a lot of small molecule manufacturing pharmaceuticals have been outsourced, most of the capacity for biologics was captive within large companies. So companies like Genentech or Genzyme or Biogen, many of these companies built their own facilities and controlled it themselves. So though on paper there was a surplus of capacity, much of that capacity wasn't accessible to smaller companies. And the amazing thing about our industry is, at that point, about 50% of the development pipeline of all the products that were going into the clinic to be tested, about 50% of that pipeline were actually owned by small companies.
Right.
So companies that might have been the innovation engine.
The innovation.
Companies that had been spun out of universities or teaching hospitals or other academic institutes that were focused on often one disease or one disease area. So very focused and very efficient, versus the big pharma, big biopharma research engines, which weren't as efficient. There was more productivity from this whole amass of small companies, each doing their own thing. They were more productive than the large pharma pouring billions of dollars into research. Isn't that fascinating?
It's absolutely fascinating.
Of course, many of those small companies ended up being acquired by the large companies once they had got to sufficient stage of development.
And I know we're talking about, a little while ago, but fast forward to today, is it still the same? Biotech is the engine?
Well, it's still largely the case, but I want to talk a little bit more about the other modalities that we focused on in building new companies, because there are differences there. So this was what's called monoclonal antibodies. This development, really originated from the 1980s with Celtech as a pioneer and others seeing this as a way of making these more complex products that could then have a bigger impact on the biology of diseases. So large amount of capacity, mainly captive, but half the pipeline in small companies who then struggle to get to access capacity.
So there's a bottleneck.
And in 2010, I spoke to one of the leading consultants in our industry, and I told him what I was thinking of doing. And he said to me, "Why are you building capacity? There's plenty of it." And I said, "No, but it's mainly captive.
Right.
It's not accessible to these companies."
Right.
And then there was a second thing happening at that time, which was a new manufacturing platform was really coming to the fore. So back in the early 2000s, single-use technologies were developed. So single-use is where traditionally you would grow these bacteria within bioreactors, and the whole thing would be stainless. All the pipeline between the bioreactor and downstream processes, chromatography and filtration and other steps would all be stainless steel.
Right.
And it would all have cleaning systems associated with it. And for the bioreactor, steaming systems, so you could sterilize. Very complex engineering setups that took a long time to build, were expensive. And this new approach was to say, we're going to do away with a lot of that because we're going to use single use. So we're still going to have a stainless body, but we're going to line it with a bag. We're going to put it in a very high quality plastic bag in which the bacteria can grow.
And the bioreactor, I guess just to put it simply, is like a piece of engineering that allows the little factories to do their thing, to create an environment that they're happy in. Is that right? And then you can pull off whatever element it is that it's producing, which will ultimately be used in the downstream drug. Something like that?
That's correct. And in some cases, which is something that Genzyme did a lot of, you can pull off continuously. And in other cases, you do it in a batch mode. But the principle is the same, that you're feeding with nutrients and the right temperature and oxygen or the lack of oxygen in order to create the right environment for the cells to grow. For these microbial in some cases or mammalian in other cases, so different types of cells.
Very interesting. And those cells differ because what the factories, them being the factories, produce differ too. It depends. That's
right. And it's really matching the right cell system, manufacturing system to the product that's been made. So for some more complex products, you need a mammalian system to manufacture those.
Very cool.
So single use then meant not just was the bioreactor lined with plastic, which at the end of the run, instead of flushing through with water and then chemicals and testing to show that you're down to parts per billion undetectable, instead you'd rinse out the bag and then you would dispose of it, which sounds like it might be wasteful, but actually studies were done to show that there's a lot less energy use if you do that versus this very extensive washing and cleaning and sterilization that's needed. But then from the bioreactor to the downstream units, all of that was disposable as well. So again, instead of having what literally would be like a Christmas tree of valves in order to steam and wash and set up the system for the next run, instead you remove a length of tubing, put another length of tubing in place that's sterile, and you're good to go.
One of the other benefits must be in pharmaceutical manufacturing, you have to prove that your cleaning is effective.
That's right.
So if you've got a single use, then that burden reduces.
Absolutely.
It's expensive and it's time consuming, isn't it?
Absolutely. And Genzyme's original standard was 2 weeks to turn around a bioreactor. Wow. Whereas with single use, you could literally turn it around in a day. Now, the paperwork probably means you need a few days, but that was no longer the bottleneck.
Wow.
So this new platform was just coming to the fore. A company in Massachusetts had recently installed 2,000 litre scale bioreactors. So this now was a scale that was meaningful in terms of the output that could be achieved. So we were able to use this new platform and we built the first, what was branded a flex factory. So the first fully disposable 2,000 litre scale facility for clients in this site, this Johnson & Johnson site that we acquired in St. Louis. So
you must have raised the money to acquire the site.
So we eventually found the right investors.
You got the right investors. Yeah.
Plus, so this facility is in St. Louis, Missouri. And St. Louis is a great place to have a business, very stable. There are a few life sciences companies there, certainly not at the level of California and Massachusetts, but there's a hub there. Good university system, so graduates coming out with the right knowledge and experience to train up in these facilities. And a very supportive city and state that wanted to keep these jobs there and grow them. And so our main support was from an investor that we found, who was a great partner to work with, but then also really good local support as well.
Yeah. And it sounds like this factory was sort of totally state-of-the-art. One of the only ones with the new platform. Is that right?
That's correct. So there was an existing piece that was approved. So we made no changes to that because that would have been disruptive. So there was an existing piece to the facility, which we continued to run and produce product for Johnson & Johnson initially. And then we added on a clinical facility using this new state-of-the-art manufacturing capability.
And was the investor fully bought into you doing that? Because it sounds like new tech, maybe a bit risky.
They were bought in. They were great to work with. About 20 or 25% of their investments are in healthcare. But you know, this was a bit of a leap of faith for them, for sure,
and for you.
And for me, and of course, here was a site that had good site leadership and 160 people. So there's a really strong organization in place, but it wasn't a business.
Right.
It was a site.
It was a site.
So we had to add
mindset had
business
to change.
development capability. We had to. There was a shift in mindset because it's different being part of a carve out, not really a startup, but a carve out new business versus being a hub on a giant international company's supply chain.
Yeah, and suddenly instead of meeting the demands of Johnson & Johnson as the sole customer, you bought it, set up the company, which was called?
So it's called Gallus Biopharmaceuticals.
Gallus Biopharmaceuticals, and there's a theme there that we'll touch on
indeed.
in a little bit. To you saying, well, actually, we want to service lots of different companies who might have tighter timelines than Johnson & Johnson. Because the small businesses, therapeutic companies, you know, now having invested in some and having worked with so many over the rest of your career as a CDMO entrepreneur and executive, that they have a fixed amount of cash, there's a burn, and they need to deliver, otherwise the companies might not survive. Right. So how did you go about changing the mindset of something that was stable? It's tough as the new leader.
Well, it's tough, but this was also an organization that had actually been through 5 other ownership changes since it was originally set up. So they were used to there being a change of the signs, but in some cases, not much else changing. So previously, Wyeth, another large pharmaceutical company, had owned the site. So there was a receptiveness. This wasn't something completely alien. What was different is exactly what you were saying, which is, hey, we're going to support smaller companies. We're going to do development work for them, process development work. Then we're going to scale their processes, and we're going to make clinical batches. And you're right, there's an intensity to that. There's nothing slack about our work with Johnson & Johnson. So we had an agreed production schedule, and a significant part of the organization was still focused on making commercial product, getting inspected by the FDA, and making sure everything stayed in good order.
Okay.
But what we did very early on was we got the organization together. We did this in groups, and we said, okay, what's working well today? What do we need to keep the exact same as it is? What do we need to change? And so we identified those things that would be different, being an independent, growing company, but no longer a satellite of a large organization. So we identified what exactly. Well, and they were part of it. It wasn't something done to them or given to them. They absolutely were part of identifying what were those changes that were needed, and how should we be organized, and what should we do differently, and what do we want to keep the exact same because it's working well and it's what's needed. Right. So that engagement was critical. I didn't have all the answers. It was the organization, the team that came up with the answers.
That makes sense. How did you build it, and what happened? What was the end outcome?
So we gave it a new name that nobody had heard of. And so, you know, here we were trying to offer services, and nobody knew who we were. So we went to conferences. The good news about working in our industry is that once somebody goes into the clinic, once you put a biologic into a human being, it's public information. So you can find out all the companies who are in clinical trials.
Okay.
And so we built a business development team that was able to identify potential customers And they weren't just US customers. There were some European customers, and in fact, some Asian customers as well. And so we would do outreach, try to find those who were looking. And then the way it works is sometimes a request for information is issued. So they want to know more about who you are and what your capabilities are.
Yep.
And then a request for proposal would be issued. And companies might be going out to 5 or even 10 companies asking for proposals.
Yeah.
So we would give them a proposal. And if they liked what we were offering, which really often was about technical capability, fit in terms of scale, access to what they needed, timing, quality for sure, which was a huge selling point we had because we were working from a basis of a team and an organization that had been doing commercial manufacturing for a number of years.
Yep.
So some of our competitors who had built a CDMO over time still weren't commercial. So that was a huge advantage we had, which is to say, we're already making commercial product. So you can trust us that we know how to do that. Where we had to gain their trust was that we could develop their processes for them.
Yep.
So we had to build out that team from having a small technical team to having a real powerhouse for development. So the first 2 years were quite slow. We didn't have a lot of new customers because we were still physically building some of the labs and building this clinical suite with the new technology.
Was the investor comfortable with that, or were they going, Mark, what's going on?
So like any business case, right? You show a plan from A to B.
Yep.
And the way you draw the line of getting from A to B probably isn't what's going to happen.
Right.
So the truth is that after 2 years, we weren't where we wanted to be. It had been slower, just establishing our name, establishing our capability, and really the credibility. So after 2 years, they said, we'd like to see this pick up. And I said, look, trust us, this will. We're starting to get traction now. And true enough, we started to win a lot of business. And our third year was a very strong year of really building out that client base and building the business. And then as we entered our fourth year, there was an opportunity to merge with another company. They were actually slightly larger than we were, but they weren't commercial.
Yep.
So we had something they didn't have.
Yep.
And
you do love a merger, don't you?
Well, the right merger. The right merger. Mergers can be tricky, right? Because there's a lot of things you've got to align, not least culture, but vision, making sure that you've got alignment there is really, really crucial.
No, I understand.
So that was actually my preferred path, was to do that merger. Johnson & Johnson were continuing to be a customer. They'd been 100% of our business on day one.
Yep.
They were still similar, actually slightly larger dollar amount of our revenue, but we've been able to bring them down to less than 50% of our business. And my projection was we bring them down to about 30% of our business because we were growing the rest. But 30%, certainly 50% was still a big piece. And there was some nervousness with our investors that, well, what if Johnson & Johnson decide that, they're done and they give us notice? We could be kind of taking a big step back, and now it would take some years to rebuild, fill in what they would leave behind. And so their preference was to explore a sale of the business. So we did that, and we had some strong interest and ended up selling the business to a company called Patheon. Patheon had been a public company. They were taken private under the leadership of Jim Mullen, who previously been the CEO of Biogen, Genzyme's neighbor in Cambridge. And Jim had really done an incredible job of professionalizing and building that business, including a partnership with a company called DSM based in the Netherlands. And he had brought in some of DSM's assets, their contract manufacturing assets, and what they lacked, they had a very strong presence in a number of different areas, but what they lacked was the biologics capability in the US that we had built. So we really fitted in neatly into their overall vision of what they wanted to build. And so we ended up being sold to Patheon. And, you know, that was an interesting moment for me because they wanted me to join and to run their biologics business, which would have been the Genzyme sites. We had acquired a smaller business based in New Jersey. So St. Louis and New Jersey sites, and then they had a site in the Netherlands and in Australia that had been DSM sites that had become part of Patheon. But, you know, after some soul searching, I realized that I didn't want to go back into a larger organization that had about 10,000 people and 30 sites. That I really, I caught the bug and I wanted to do it again.
So you said to them, thanks, but no thanks?
I said to them, well, they said to me, it's a condition of selling the business that I come with it. And so it was one of those moments of going back to them and saying, you know, I want to be completely honest with you. I don't want to come with the business, and happy to help the transition, be here for 6 months if that helps. But I don't see my long-term future with Patheon. So they could have walked away, right? I didn't know what that might mean.
And they said.
And thankfully they were gracious and understood that and concluded that they wanted to go ahead anyway because they still valued the business even if I wasn't there.
Right. And you said you got the bug.
Yes.
What was it about it that kind of got you hooked? The excitement of building something new, benefiting patients, building, creating employment, happy people, happy customers, you know, all of the above. What was it that really captivated you over that journey?
Yeah. I mean, it's to some extent all of the above, but you know, the opportunity to make a difference in patients' lives. I mean, it's really what I'd seen from Genzyme, pioneering into spaces that others hadn't been in and making an impact that you know, on an individual basis could be life-changing. For me, that was the motivation. That was the desire to do that. Doing it as a CEO and as a founder, really the satisfaction of creating something, of partnering with others to build an organization and lead it, of scaling, of doing things at a scale that's impactful, working with investors that share that vision and want to see the growth. And frankly, you know, recognizing that they're not in it forever, right? They're managing other people's money, so they want to see a return in a reasonable time frame, and then move on to the next thing. And you know, that's not terrible as an entrepreneur either, because then it allowed me to move on to the next thing. So, really, all of those.
We met sort of towards the end of your next thing,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll talk about the next thing. But I remember I asked you, and you were with your wife at the time, because you were just about to do another thing after the next thing, which we'll talk about too. You definitely got the bug.
Mm-hmm.
I said, you know, because the next thing was, hope we don't get embarrassed in me saying this, wildly successful.
Mm-hmm.
I said, you know, yeah, good now, and done it twice. Why are you doing it again? And I remember, this is not word for word, but you looked at me and you said, James, there's still so much to do. There's still so many diseases out there that need cured, and innovators need manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to keep doing that. And you mentioned that you knew people who were suffering and you wanted to keep going and keep building for that very reason. Mm-hmm. So that stuck with me. Mm-hmm. I remember it really clearly. Struck a chord with me, because that's what I'm really excited about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's. I'm on the other side, I guess, which is the therapeutic side.
Right.
But it's about, okay, there's people out there who are suffering through no fault of their own. Some of them are really, really suffering. How do we help these people through business? How do we create an idea and take that idea to investors, get them bought in, and then make the idea a reality? And to do that, you need the innovation, you need the manufacturing, which is what you've done. So the next thing.
Well, just to add to what you were saying, some people might look at business creation and think it's about money, making money. What I remember Henry saying was, when we think about these diseases, if we can show that we have a cure or a treatment that allows people to live normally, we'll figure the rest out. So the point is about the outcome. And you may be going into completely new territory about the cost of it, or how does it get paid for, how does it get approved. But this industry is all about generating data that shows that you've got something that's safe, or at least if it's not 100% safe, you know what the risks are, and that it's efficacious, that it makes a difference to people's lives. And it's an honor and a privilege to spend your life's work doing something that may impact people that you may never meet, probably will never meet, but you may meet a few of them. And when you hear their stories, it's an amazing thing. Yeah. So it's a worthwhile thing to spend your days doing. Right?
Yeah. No, I agree. So what happened next?
Well, so at Gallus, we were focused on monoclonal antibodies. I'd always been interested in cell therapy. Genzyme was a pioneer in that space. We got the first FDA-approved product, cell therapy product. In fact, we worked with the regulators to write the regulations because there weren't any governing cell therapy products. And in gene therapy, Genzyme did one of the first human trials in gene therapy in cystic fibrosis in the early 90s, and it failed. Couldn't deliver the genetic material through the mucosal layer for these CF patients. But I'd always been interested in cell therapy, started exploring that at Gallus, but we didn't get anything off the ground. And so when Gallus sold, I thought, okay, next business, let's look at cell therapy and dig into this. And I spent a year working with a partner, developing a plan around cell therapy, identified a facility we could use. What we didn't want to do was just lease a facility and start to build a team with no clients, with no past experience. So we were trying to figure out, how do you get this off the ground? What's that initiation energy to get it going? And our thought was, let's work with a company where they'll be our anchor tenant, our anchor client, and that will get the business going. And we came very close. We had a company that was planning to enter phase 3, and we were working with them. We were talking about doing a press release. We were that close to setting up manufacturing for them. When Hillary Clinton made a statement as part of her presidential run that she was going to make sure that pharmaceutical pricing was looked at, and the bottom dropped out of the market for pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies. So this was in the autumn of 2015. And the company that we were partnering with, again, talking about doing a press release, said to us, we were planning to raise money to do this. We can't raise money now. Right. And so that evaporated. And then we were, in parallel with that, we were also talking to another company about acquiring them. And their lead client we said, you need to get some commitment to demand so we know that there's a more sustainable base. And their lead client basically had backed out of what they thought they were going to commit to because they were waiting for clinical data. So I found myself early 2016 not being sure, having spent a year working on this, not being sure how we could actually take the next step. And then I got reconnected with the private equity group who I'd met with back in 2010. And they had just acquired an early stage cell and gene therapy contract manufacturer called Florida Biologics. And that company is called Ampersand, and they happen to be based in Massachusetts. So what they had was an organization with about 100, 105 people. They'd been doing early clinical supply for 10 years in exactly the space we were interested in. What they wanted was a leadership team, and they wanted to grow it to be commercial. And what we had was a design for a commercial-ready facility in Massachusetts, where many of the end users were, the clients were. And so literally in 6 weeks from the first conversation,
wow,
we concluded merging our plan and investments in with what they had recently spun out of University of Florida, this site which was in northern Florida.
That's fast.
And so, yeah, because we relied on a lot of the diligence they had done for their spin out. And again, looking at it, this was absolutely the right thing to do. So March 2016, we got that business going, and we basically hit the wave of gene therapy, really becoming a very hot area, tremendous potential to cure diseases with potentially one treatment for patients.
It's interesting to see that evolution from the enzymatic replacement during the earlier days to, right, we can actually cure this.
That's right.
Because we're going to engineer the body to just produce the enzyme that's missing. Yeah, fascinating.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
So we went, over the next 3 years, we went from 100 people to 600, and we invested $200 million in capacity. So a huge sum of money.
Whoa.
We acquired 2 facilities from Biogen. One was a commercial biologics facility in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The other one was a warehouse, GMP warehouse that supported this. And we were able to convert that facility into a gene therapy manufacturing facility.
And your approach to facilities, has it always been, let's have the state-of-the-art kit, let's build the best we can possibly build because the customers will like that? Because you probably know that some of your colleagues and friends talk about Bamforth facilities and they're all super new and there's automation wherever you can and that kind of stuff. So you always had that mindset, let's build the best to be the best?
Well, that's an interesting question. If something exists and it's approved, it's very hard to change, right? There's a huge inertia in our industry because once you've approved something, to go back and make significant changes and go through the regulatory process, potentially in multiple countries, it can take years. And so there's a huge inertia that sets in once you have commercial manufacturing in place. But before that, when you're in the clinic, the ability to innovate, to bring in new technologies, to show that they're equivalent or better in making the product in terms of product quality, product safety, you have much more freedom to do that. And why wouldn't you do that? Now, automation sounds great, and certainly there are opportunities for automation. But in fact, when you're in development, a lot of what you're doing has to be very flexible and adaptable, which means you may have islands of automation. So running a bioreactor, for example, may be highly controlled, but it probably stands alone from the next step in the process and the next step.
Makes sense.
So it's not that these are like fully robotic facilities or anything like that, but you're using the latest technology to try to make the product, but also the analytics. And certainly on the gene therapy side, there were a lot of novel analytics being developed to measure, for example, have you put, so you're using a viral vector as a delivery mechanism to get genetic material into cells. But in the manufacturing, have you put the genetic code into every viral particle for delivery? So full versus empty.
Oh.
And so again, some very novel analytics that were being developed and we were involved with that were needed to really understand these products and what you have, what you're giving to patients. So we hit this incredibly important development time of the industry. And by 2019, you had people like Gottlieb, the head of the FDA, saying by 2025, we expect 20 to 25 approvals a year of gene therapy products. Now that compared to around 20 to 30 products in total being approved, biological products by the FDA. So huge expansion driven by gene therapy.
Think that will happen by 2025?
Well, there was another study at that time by MIT which said by 2022, so this year, we would have 40 approved gene therapy products. We have less than half of that.
It's been a tough ride, hasn't it?
It has been a tough ride. And, obviously, we've got to be incredibly careful, right? You're putting genetic code into people.
For sure.
So you got to know it's safe and
Big deal.
doing and it's sustainable, right? That if you're delivering this once, how long does the effect last for? But companies like BioMarin on hemophilia, or companies like Bluebird on their sickle cell disease, they have made great progress. Yeah. And although it's been slower than people wanted, we are seeing those approvals coming through.
Yes.
And this continues to be a very exciting area.
It is very exciting.
Many clinical trials ongoing, as you know.
Super exciting. Cell and gene therapy is super exciting.
So we're behind where people hoped we would be, but we're still making tremendous progress.
Yeah. So the organization went through kind of hyper growth.
Right.
100 to 600.
Right.
Whoa.
Yeah.
In a very short period of time. Now that must have been very challenging for everybody, including you as the CEO. It achieved an outcome that perhaps nobody was expecting in the time frame that it happened, right?
Well, we looked in 2019 and we realized that the company, which is called Brammer Bio, by the way, that Brammer was supporting a third of the late stage gene therapy pipeline of the industry.
Wow.
Now, if we go back to monoclonal antibodies, about 15% of those were outsourced, going back a decade. 85% were within the large biopharma. I'm sorry, that's wrong. Let me restate that. I think about half of the products were outsourced versus being within the large biopharma. Here in gene therapy, it was estimated that about 85% of the products were outsourced.
Okay.
And that's because the facilities and the knowledge, the know-how was so specialized that there were very few who at that point knew how to make these products. And yet new companies were popping up. They were licensing out technologies from innovation centers, hospitals that were doing this pioneering work, and creating companies around even one patient data, one patient being apparently cured with a therapy. They were then taking that and creating a company around that and raising $100 million in a number of cases. They were then coming saying, okay, we need supply and we need it now because we have a product that we think is working. They were trying to compress all the timelines. So whereas a traditional biologic takes 10 to 12 years to develop, take all the way through clinical trials and get approved, these companies were trying to go from first in human to approval in 4 years. That was their stated aim, which caused a lot of compression then on the supply side to establish the capacity.
Right.
So in 2019, having spent $200 million and had this huge expansion, we realized that to keep pace with this, we actually needed to spend another $200 million. Now, the first $200 million, where did it come from? Well, it came from investors to get this off the ground. It came from, we were able to borrow money because we had a long-term contract, so we could borrow money against that. We were earning. We were positive cash flow, so some of it was coming from our earnings. And then companies were willing to pay deposits, significant deposits, to secure capacity. So that had helped fund our first $200 million investment. But we didn't have $200 million for the next investment. So we started looking outside and saying, how do we fund this? And that led to us eventually discussing with a number of potential buyers. And that led to Thermo Fisher buying the company, which concluded at the end of April 2019.
Yeah. And that was for a lot of money.
That was for $1.7 billion.
Yeah. The investors must have been very happy.
The investors were very happy. But, you know, the great thing is, as we said earlier, this isn't about money, but of course the investors are stewards of other people's money, right?
For sure.
Their money comes from pension funds and others, so they're absolutely focused on delivering a return. But for me, the key thing is, so what happens after those companies are sold?
Yeah.
So the company in St. Louis, the site in St. Louis, I should say, has gone through a major further expansion. So that site that had gone through different ownership now is a bigger site doing more impactful work. and then Brammer, we wanted to build another commercial facility, having already established two. And about a month ago, that new facility was opened, one of the largest gene therapy facilities in the world.
Amazing.
By Thermo Fisher. So
amazing.
The point is that the momentum and the growth and the jobs and the products to make an impact on patients continue on that trajectory.
That's it. Ultimately, I think it's very different to like a software acquisition where it's just stripped and embedded and the people go. It's necessary to ultimately achieve the scale that's required for patients. What were the kind of key learnings then over the course of the hypergrowth? And second question, how do we have more hypergrowth companies in Scotland? What do we need to do?
Well, so the key learnings, I would say, in the hypergrowth at Brammer was understanding the need that was there, the demand that was there. And you know, one of the challenges for us is, are you pursuing we will build it and they will come strategy? So you can do some of that. In fact, frankly, you have to do some of that because in our industry, at least, you can't sell something until you built it. And even when you built it, you have to prove it's working. Nobody wants to be the guinea pig, first one in. So you really have to make investment. And then the question is, how much do you try to bite off? And how far ahead do you try to be? So that takes some courage, right? And it takes some alignment for sure with investors that are prepared to go on this journey with you. The investors I worked with at Brammer and in my third company, same company, Ampersand, this is all that they do. So whereas the first company investors did some investment in healthcare, but also in other areas, it's great to work with an investor that's only focused on healthcare because they really understand the ebb and flow and the specific characteristics around this. So and I'll describe a little bit about the third company where it didn't go in quite the same pattern, but the point really is that you want to continue to grow. You want to pivot if you have to, respond to what the market's telling you. Certainly, you got to get ahead of the curve. So you have to be building in anticipation of demand, or because you have enough data points to say it's there. But you can't wait till you have certainty.
Yeah.
If you wait till then, you're probably too late.
It's too late
because somebody else has done it. Somebody else took that leap of faith.
How did you manage the people within the organization who were going through what sounds like constant change? So
I would say that one of the greatest challenges in any business is managing people. And that's really understanding people's capabilities today, but also their capability of growth and where they could go in the future. nobody's a perfect judge of people. So it's also great to get other perspectives. We would use, for example, a tool called a 9-grid matrix, which is really trying to identify people's potential versus their performance. And it's a very challenging exercise to go through and talk about your own team and say, well, this person's got high potential, but they're not performing. Why are they not performing? Is it something in their personal life? Is it just that nobody's sat them down and told them, you can do this? What's holding them back? And at the other end of the scale, if somebody's not performing and you don't see them having the potential, then you have to move them on, because having people in your organization that are dragging others down ends up being bad for everyone.
Yeah.
And people say, why am I working so hard when that person seems to get away with not doing their fair share or not delivering?
Yeah. One of the things that quite a famous Scottish entrepreneur said to me a while ago was, if you're running a marathon and you've got a stone in your shoe, when do you take it out?
As soon as you can.
At the start or at the end? Take it out as soon as you blooming can, because it gets worse and worse and worse. And I think what you say about it being the best thing for everyone is probably true, right? And at the end of the day, it's about the company fulfilling its vision.
Right.
And I guess it's your job as the CEO to always act fairly and treat everyone with respect. Get the best out of people as much as you can, but if there's not a good fit, then that happens, right?
That's right. And sometimes there'll be somebody maybe in a role that's not a good fit, but they're a good person.
Yeah.
So you examine and say, well, is there a different role? And again, having an honest discussion with them.
Yeah.
Because the more honest you are with people, you get that back in turn.
For sure.
So you say to them, I don't think this is working well for you. They're probably going to say, no, I hate it. This is what I don't like.
Yeah.
But maybe you can find a different role that is the right fit.
Yeah.
And so leadership of an organization and trying to inculcate that throughout the organization, that it's really about making sure people are in the right role.
Yep.
And for those who are high performers, giving them experience, giving them opportunities to develop. And sometimes people get fixated on a career ladder, like you always have to be going up. Well, sometimes you want to go sideways and gain experience, because that's going to help you go up now with a broader base of experience.
Yeah.
So that's fundamental to being able to grow. Certainly in hypergrowth is crucial.
Yeah. And did everyone in Brammer have a part of the business? Were they incentivized through some ownership in the company?
They did. So at Gallus, we didn't have that opportunity. We only had, like, the top leadership team had a stake in the business, and I really wanted to change that, and Ampersand were completely supportive. So we created a share appreciation rights, which is a US scheme. But in essence, everybody had the equivalent of options. Everybody.
Yeah.
And what that meant was, when we had a really good payout, everybody participated in that. And frankly, that was a great day to know that everyone's supervisors, line managers, frontline workers, everybody in the organization was going to get something because of what they'd helped to create.
Yep. Amazing. Did you ever, to help the organization perform as best as it can, get patients in to tell their stories, or get the companies to come in and say, look, we're working on this super innovative medicine, and this is the impact you could have, just to really fire up the workforce?
So one of the experiences from Genzyme, which was very powerful, was having patients come in. And of course, with rare diseases, there are often patient organizations, and they would arrange to bring in patients, and incredibly motivating for people. We'd have their pictures on the walls. I mean, it was very motivating. What's hard as a contract manufacturer is you're a step removed from that. So we would do a couple of things, like you said. we'd have either the companies come in and explain what their platform was, what diseases they were focused on, where they were in the clinic. And that was great. People enjoyed that. And that really created, again, a strong bond, because for us, they were the customer. That's who we were trying to satisfy so they could go and help patients. And then in a number of cases, we were able to have patients or people from patient organizations come and talk about their disease area. So we did that several times, not as frequently as we were able to at Genzyme, where we're an innovator company. But yeah, if you want to connect everybody to that patient story and that outcome.
And at the start, you mentioned sort of creating a vision.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a fundamental aspect to the CEO's role?
It absolutely is, because if you don't have a vision, how do you know that you're going in the right direction? And the point about a vision as well is it should be aspirational. It should be something that isn't easily obtainable or in the near term, but it's something that everyone can feel that they strive for. And if somebody's at dinner with friends and they get asked, well, what do you do? You'd hope they'd be able to talk about the vision.
Yeah.
This is what we're trying to do as a company.
Yeah.
And that's really important.
What was the vision at Brammer initially?
This organization in Florida had really an exceptional history, 10 years of delivering clinical material for cell and gene therapy. And so the vision really was to take that amazing history and now build an organization that could deliver these products into pivotal trials, so the final stage of clinical trials, and then from that, commercial supply. So that was the vision. And we ended up, we adopted, a tagline, helping to cure. The idea that with these products that you could actually cure somebody of a disease by giving them the genetic code that inside their body they could manufacture what was missing. It's pretty amazing.
Sounds like something from a sci-fi film, doesn't
right.
it? We're going to get this into you through a viral vector.
Right.
And it's going to sort of stick it in.
Right.
And then you're good. It's just so amazing. Mm-hmm. A lot of people, I think, don't realize just what goes into manufacturing a pharmaceutical or manufacturing a product, and the rigor, the control, the consistency required, the regulatory accreditation is a whole nother world, isn't it?
Right.
But it's also a business. Mm-hmm. And I'd imagine it's quite a tough business because you've got to meet the demands of your customers, right? And also maintain your margins.
Right.
So do you think your training at the big company Genzyme helped you for your journey as an entrepreneur? Or was it more like, okay, this is very, very different. I need to figure this out?
So it helped in many aspects in terms of experiences I'd had, but what I hadn't had was the experience around how do you contract, right? What is appropriate? How do you price things? How are you going to do this in a way that's sustainable? And how do you price so that you can win contracts? What's a reasonable win rate? So there's a whole learning around that, which I gained a lot of knowledge from working with others who had real expertise in business development. But what I really came to recognize was that I should sign a contract with any client because I was committing the company to deliver on the promises to that client.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. I asked you a question about Scotland. Mm-hmm. So what are the kind of differences between and I know you're big on Scotland. It's your home country and families here, and you do a lot of work with Entrepreneurial Scotland. Mm-hmm. You're now also supporting innovators in Scotland. But we're not known for being Centre of Excellence for Pharmaceutical Manufacturing. We used to be known for phenomenal manufacturing. Mm-hmm. And we spoke earlier about the Clyde and shipbuilding and steel, and it's kind of gone, right? Mm-hmm. So what do you think we need to do so that when people think pharma, they think Scotland, not Singapore.
Yeah.
Scotland.
Yeah. So Scotland has a strong reputation for producing science graduates, more than are needed within the industry. So often then they go elsewhere, or maybe they go home if they came to Scotland from abroad. So you got a strong foundation, right, in terms of an educated workforce that knows about this area. Scotland has a strong life sciences sector, but a lot of it is service-based, with a few showcase facilities for large pharma that are based in Scotland, but those companies aren't headquartered in Scotland. And historically, when people in Scotland have developed businesses and then sold those businesses, sometimes that's meant then that there's still a hub in Scotland, but the real prize has moved away.
Yeah.
It's been taken somewhere else. So the answer to your question is build manufacturing in Scotland. So manufacturing in this industry is very sticky, i.e. it's hard to move because it's regulated. Once it's in place for commercial supply, then it can grow. And so build a manufacturing hub with innovators.
And we're not really doing that much of that, are we?
We're not, but there can be encouragement. So you mentioned Singapore. Why would anyone go to Singapore? Well, the answer is they set up the economics to make it attractive.
Yeah.
Well-educated workforce, a hub in Asia.
Great connectivity through the airport.
Absolutely. So all the infrastructure needed, but also other policies that were supportive of it.
Yeah.
So Scotland could do more to encourage manufacturing and support it. And I work with Scottish Enterprise on a number of innovator companies where I see great support from them to help establish and grow these companies.
For sure.
And the question is there support there to grow them long term and really grow them to scale?
I mean, Scottish Enterprise do a massive amount for innovators in this country. And for me, fundamental in getting things off the ground. But there's that next step, and then the next step after that, to really achieve the kind of global scale and global ambition. And what seems to happen is, because the capital base in the US, for example, is so much deeper, people go over to the US or they go down south to the Golden Triangle. So yeah, maybe there is some economic incentives, some long-term incentivization for companies to come here. And perhaps we should get Nicola Sturgeon on the podcast and and ask her what the plans are. Why not?
I look forward to that one.
Why not? Yeah, that would be a good one. So you did a lot of work on biologics. And then you must have become aware of a kind of new kind of biologic. And perhaps instead of them acting as factories within the bioreactor, somebody at some point said, hold on a second, if they're producing these chemicals that we're isolating that might benefit people, then why do we not just give the bugs to people? So when did you first come across the microbiome, and how did that kind of shape up?
So I actually first came across the microbiome around 2015-16. A colleague said to me, whilst I was obviously working on cell and gene therapy, said to me, hey, you should look at the microbiome. There's a lot going on there. And at that point, there was one of the honeymoons of the microbiome where things were going well until they didn't go so well. And, it's been an up and down area for sure. And I said to him, I don't have capacity to look at that. And then I got Brammer off the ground. And within a year, I had another former colleague approach me and said, I'm trying to set up my manufacturing. Could you give me a space in one of your facilities? I said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to handle these bacteria. And I said, where are they coming from? And he said, well, they're actually human donated bacteria. And I said, I can't mix that. So I was conscious from around that time that this was a challenging area in terms of supply. B, it wasn't something that you could readily drop into a general facility doing other biologics. And C, that investors seem to be paying attention to this area as having potential. So then I forgot about it for a couple of years as I was busy. And
it probably went through a few ups and downs during those few years, as is the way with this field.
Exactly. Yeah. And then in April of 2019, just as Brammer was selling, I happened to get an email introducing me to a guy called Dr. Aaron Cowley, who had been in the field for 10 years, the microbiome field.
Yes.
And had set up a small business and was the CTO of it, doing process development. And he'd made some forays into clinical supply, rudimentary clinical supply for some of these companies. But really the expertise was around process development. And a couple of months after that, I went and visited him with a colleague and realized that what he had was pretty small. It was still, small team, about a dozen people. But the more I explored this area, the more I realized that there was nothing out there of any substance.
From a manufacturing perspective.
For manufacturing. Absolutely, from a manufacturing perspective. So a lot of companies now in this space, around 100 companies, but very little set up for manufacturing. And interestingly, in April 2019, Lonza, one of the largest CDMOs in the industry, had announced a joint venture in Europe to establish manufacturing for this space. Of course, my first reaction was, drat, they've got to it first.
Yep.
And I thought, actually, that's good news because it validates the space.
For sure.
And they're in Europe.
For sure.
And we're going to do this in the US. And quite a number of the microbiome pioneers are in the US. And again, a lack of supply. Yeah. And so what they had done, many of the pioneers had established their own capacity. And when I asked them, why did you do it? They said, because there was nowhere else to go. And of course, what they had done was built early clinical capacity. They hadn't built commercial ready capacity.
For the listener, we've talked a lot about clinical supply, commercial supply. Talk us through some of the differences from a manufacturing perspective, scale, validation, regs, that kind of stuff.
So clinical supply, often there's a requirement just to get a batch of product that meets an initial specification so it can go and be tested. And if it's to go into humans, it has to be clinical and it has to be made to good manufacturing practices, standards that are set out by the regulators. But the scale often is small. Whereas for later trials where you're going into larger numbers of patients, the scale needs to go up. And then for commercial, the final stage of testing is called pivotal testing or phase 3. That needs to be made in a facility that can be approved by the regulators for commercial supply. So you're really using the process that will be the commercial process. And nobody had established that capacity. And so what we really did was focused on expanding what was already in place that Aaron had set up, which happened to be in northern Florida as well, by coincidence, and then building a commercial facility in the alligators. With the alligators. Building a commercial facility in Massachusetts.
Got it.
For phase 3 in commercial supply.
Right. Did you go back to the same investors again then?
Yes.
And said, look, got another vision, guys.
That's right.
Yep.
And they did their own research and they agreed that, this appears to be an interesting area with some significant potential for patients and underserved. So let's do it. So we raised more money this time because we didn't have contracts in place, so we knew we wouldn't get debt anytime soon. We weren't able to buy a significant facility to start with. It was a small capability. So we knew we had to invest more to build out the capabilities.
Yep. And
that's what we did.
And how did you know that merging with Aaron's company was the right thing to do? What when you mentioned, and I mentioned you love a merger. I was kind of winding up a little bit, but there's a recurring theme, right? You're merging to go faster and to bring together capability to create something that is better than the individual parts, right?
So what I love is a platform.
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So I love having an experience base. So give an example with Aaron, one of the first conferences I went to with him, we met with a company. He had made material for them. No, he developed a process for them and transferred it to another CDMO because he didn't have the capability 6 years earlier. So 6 years later, this company's advanced in the clinic. They wanted to meet with Aaron to ask him questions about the process development and why the process worked the way it did and what they could do to improve it 6 years later. So what that said to me is he has an expertise that doesn't exist at the company that this client had gone to. They'd gone to a company that could run it for them, but they didn't actually understand how it worked or what was important.
Right.
So the platform is really the knowledge base and the reputation in the industry. What we had to add was expand the physical assets and expand the team.
Yep. And that's what you did.
That's what we did.
But the field, as you know, has gone like that, like a sine wave.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of a few things, I think. Clinical failure.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2019, there were some deaths associated with what people call FMT. Movement of microbes from one person to another. And I think, certainly from my side, all of that dampened down the enthusiasm. Mm-hmm. And you were just about going, I think, weren't you, with
That's right.
the third company, which was called
ArrantaBio, which is a Gaelic word.
Yeah, yeah. So the theme was Gaelic names for your companies.
Scottish slang or Gaelic,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, no, it's cool. It's really cool. So what happened then with Arranta? How did it progress?
Well, so of course COVID happened, and remarkably we were able to navigate continuing to support clients. You know, we did a variety of things to ensure safety and spread people out and other things that I won't go into detail on, but we continue to support clients. We continue to build our new commercial ready facility. But the industry was that sector was definitely growing slower, and we saw lack of investor enthusiasm for it, and of course, if the investors aren't funding the companies aren't coming to us. So we had half of the companies in our pipeline that we were talking to about supporting them, who were saying to us, "We don't have the money. We want to move ahead, but we don't have the money, and we're not sure when we'll get it." So we realized that this, whilst we still believe in this and believe that this will make a major impact in healthcare, it's going to be a slower process to get there.
Right.
And so we decided for the first time in the three companies to pivot, to basically add another platform in order to support growing at the pace we wanted to grow at. So we studied the market, and we recognized that with mRNA vaccines that there was a pretty broken supply chain. Development companies would often go to 3 or even 4 different contract manufacturers to get the different pieces of their product made. So plasmid, and then the creation of the mRNA itself, and then the formulation into lipid nanoparticle, and then the sterile fill finish of it. Often those would be done by different organizations.
Wow.
So we developed a plan, and we took it to our board that under one roof, we could supply all of this. And your earlier question about technologies, so part of the answer to being able to do that was to use a robotic system for fill finish. A very innovative system.
Very cool.
That's been developed, which again would allow us to do clinical scale batches very efficiently.
Question for you. At Brammer, someone approached you and said, "I'd like to do bugs in your facility." And you said, no, can't do that because capacity, but also the nature of the products. But what you're saying here is you're wanting to do bugs and mRNA, which goes into an injectable, which is typically sterile. Right.
Quite. Absolutely.
So how did you navigate that? Separate facilities, same facility, different processes?
So same building with dedicated facilities within it. So dedicated suites with no crossover of materials or people. So you're absolutely right. We had to engineer that to show that we could do this in a way that was segregated.
Yeah. So that's a challenge. And obviously there's a customer piece as well. You need to get them comfy.
Right, absolutely.
So obviously Arranta's still going, but...
Arranta's still going, but we had an unsolicited approach at the end of 2021 and decided to sell the business to a European-based contract manufacturer called Recipharm.
Yep.
And Arranta's continuing to grow as part of that organization.
Right.
And again, it was a fit with what they were looking for, which was really a strong bridgehead into the US and a stronger presence in biologics, which they didn't have prior to that.
Right. And Arranta decided to focus on what we call single strain and consortia in terms of therapeutic approach, but there's other approaches as well.
Right.
Some people say the FMT type approach, take a donor, extract, process, is unlikely to be the future. It's going to be single strain or consortia. How's your thinking evolved on that over time? And are there any parallels between like that and some of the other work you did in antibodies, for example?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because my perception with FMT was that was like generation 1.0.
Yep.
And that this could be replaced with rationally designed consortia. So growing 5, 6, 10, 12 bacteria and then pooling them. What I think is fascinating is I compare this to polyclonal antibodies, where I had the experience at Genzyme of us acquiring a product that was made by having rabbits produce antibodies to human thymus. This is for transplant patients. And there are about 50 different components in that soup that the rabbits would produce this polyclonal antibody. And the scientists at the time said, well, we need to analyze this and figure out which ones are important. Well, that's a huge experiment, right?
Yeah.
If you've got 50 different elements, because it may be that some of the ones that are trace are actually really important. And maybe a combination is also really important.
Yeah, it might be they behave slightly differently in the body because they're next to X or Y. So
the answer is that's not something to solve. It's not something valuable to solve, frankly, because in that case, that was a polyclonal that was very effective to allow patients to go through transplantation. Yeah. And I think with FMT, if we show that FMT is effective, then provided we can demonstrate the safety of the product and the ability to manufacture it consistently and safely, then I think that could be a product that has unique applications where it is the best product for patients.
Yeah. I mean, needless to say, I agree. But those challenges you mentioned, safety, consistency, they're pretty big challenges, aren't they? Mm-hmm. How do you think about consistency in the context of a product like that? And what parallels are there to what you've seen in the past?
Well, the key for me would be the analytics. So being able to measure what's there. And both positively, i.e. these are the bacteria that they want, but also negatively, these are the things that we don't want to see present. Whether it's specific bacteria or pathogens or some other agents. So the analytics become key. And if you look at a lot of scientific development, it's hinged on having the right analytics. And sometimes the right analytics means that you can look at old products and say, wow, you'd never get that approved today because we didn't understand it as fully as we can understand it today. So it behoves us to use all of the tools that at our disposal to know that we're making a consistent and safe product.
Yeah. The regulators will demand that as well, wouldn't they?
they should demand it, and they will demand it.
Yeah. Couple of final questions for you, Mark, if you don't mind, and thanks so much for your time. You've built and sold 3 companies. What advice do you have for other innovators who are coming through, who want to emulate that success? And if you could go back, speak to your earlier self, anything you would say now, having been on the journey?
So my advice really is to have a vision of what you want to do. Surround yourself by people that you can partner with, who complement you, who bring skills and capabilities that you don't have, or you don't have as strongly as they may have. So set the course. Keep checking. Are we on track? Does it still make sense? Be ready to pivot if you need to. But just continue with that determination to make an impact and find a pathway forward.
And you're doing a bit of work now on the other side where you're investing. How's that been for you?
Well, so what I really enjoy now isn't just investing, it's really investing and mentoring. So being able to be involved with several companies where I can help to offer my insights, my perspective on what they're doing, which doesn't cover everything they're doing, right? Often there are areas of particular expertise that I'm learning about, which is interesting in itself, but really offer from my experience where I think there are opportunities or watch outs. And then it's incredibly satisfying to see others grow and make an impact. And so being able to help make a difference through the work with them.
Awesome. Mark, on that note, I think we can conclude. Thanks so much. That's been awesome. Really appreciate your time.
James, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. To learn more about the guest on today's episode or more about the Inside Matters podcast, please visit insidematters.health. Thank you.